The white horse reared back on its hind legs, nostrils flaring as thick smoke billowed from the barn. Inside, 12-year-old James Harper lay unconscious on the has-strewn floor, flames licking at the wooden beams above him. His father, real estate tycoon Richard Harper, stood frozen in horror at the sight of the burning structure, the same barn where he had locked his son just hours earlier as punishment. As neighbors gathered at the property line, they witnessed something extraordinary. The family's majestic white stallion, Phantom, kicking through the barn doors with tremendous force, rushing inside amid the inferno. Moments later, the horse emerged, dragging the unconscious boy to safety by the collar of his shirt, just as the roof collapsed in a shower of burning embers. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Richard Harper was not a man accustomed to being disappointed. At 45, he had built Harper Developments into the most successful real estate company in Willow Creek, transforming the once sleepy agricultural town into a burgeoning suburban paradise. His imposing white colonial mansion, situated on 20 acres of prime land that had once been a working farm, was a testament to his success and to the power he wielded in the community. The town respected Richard Harper, but they did not love him. Behind his back, they whispered about his ruthless business tactics, his tendency to steamroll over anyone who stood in his way. They gossiped about the way he'd acquired properties from struggling farmers during the economic downturn, how he'd turned generations of agricultural heritage into cookie-cutter housing developments with names like Orchard Estates and Meadowview, places where no orchards or meadows remained. But no one gossiped more about Richard Harper than they did about his relationship with his only son, James. James was not the son Richard had envisioned having. Where Richard was broad-shouldered and commanding, James was slight and soft-spoken. Where Richard had excelled at football and wrestling in his youth, James preferred books and art. Where Richard saw the world in black and white, James saw it in watercolors and poetry. "The boy needs to toughen up," Richard would tell his wife, Eleanor, as they lay in bed at night, his voice carrying down the hallway to where James often sat, knees pulled to his chest, listening. "He'll never survive in this world if he doesn't learn to stand up for himself." Eleanor, a former art history professor who had given up her career when she married Richard, would sigh and turn away. "He's 12, Richard. Let him be who he is." But Richard couldn't or wouldn't accept who his son was. And on this particular Friday in early October, his frustration had reached a breaking point. James had come home from school with a black eye and torn backpack, the contents scattered across the marble floor of the foyer as he emptied the bag to assess the damage. His favorite sketchbook was torn nearly in half, pencil drawings of horses and landscapes smudged beyond repair. "What happened?" Eleanor had rushed to her son's side, gently turning his face to examine the bruise blooming around his left eye. James hesitated, his lower lip trembling. "Brad Thompson said I draw like a girl. He grabbed my sketchbook during lunch and started showing everyone. When I tried to get it back, he pushed me down." Richard, who had been passing through the foyer on his way to his home office, stopped abruptly. "And what did you do about it?" James looked down at his shoes. "I went to the principal." Richard's face hardened. "You went to the principal? Instead of standing up for yourself?" "Mr. Dawson says we're supposed to tell an adult instead of fighting," James said quietly. "Mr. Dawson," Richard spat the name like it was poison, "is raising a generation of weaklings. No son of mine is going to run crying to the teacher every time some kid gives him trouble." Richard, Eleanor's voice, held a warning. Richard ignored her, focusing his attention entirely on his son. "Did you at least get a punch in? Tell me you didn't just lie there and take it." James's silence was answer enough. "That's it." Richard threw his hands up in exasperation. "This stops now. Go change your clothes. We're going to the barn." Eleanor stepped between them. "What are you planning, Richard?" "I'm going to teach our son how to be a man," Richard said, his voice dangerously low. "Since clearly no one else is going to do it. He's a child, Richard. He needs exactly what I'm going to give him," Richard cut her off. "James, I said go change. Wear something you don't mind getting dirty." James looked to his mother, his eyes wide with uncertainty. "It's okay, honey," Eleanor said softly, though her eyes, fixed on her husband, were hard with anger. "Go on upstairs. I need to talk to your father." Once James was out of earshot, Eleanor rounded on Richard. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" "I'm doing what should have been done years ago," Richard said. "My father taught me how to defend myself when I was half his age. It's long overdue." "Your father was a cruel man," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "Is that really who you want to emulate?" A shadow passed over Richard's face. "My father made me strong. That's what I'm going to do for James." "By what? Teaching him to hit back? That's not strength, Richard. That's just perpetuating violence. It's teaching him to stand up for himself." Richard's voice rose. "Do you want him to go through life being everyone's punching bag? Is that what you want for our son?" Eleanor stood her ground. "What I want is for him to know his worth doesn't depend on whether he can throw a punch. What I want is for his father to love him for who he is, not who you wish he was." Richard's jaw tightened. "I do love him. That's why I'm doing this." "No," Eleanor shook her head sadly. "You love the idea of him. You don't see him at all." Before Richard could respond, James appeared at the top of the stairs, dressed in jeans and an old t-shirt, his movements hesitant. "I'm ready, Dad," he said, his voice small. Richard looked up at his son, then back at his wife. "We'll be in the barn. Dinner can wait." As Richard led James across the sprawling backyard toward the old barn, the last remaining structure from the property's farming days, Eleanor watched from the kitchen window, a sense of dread settling in her stomach. The barn was a massive structure, weathered by time but still sturdy. Richard had kept it standing when he purchased the property, partly because it was cheaper than tearing it down, and partly because he thought it added rustic charm to the estate. It housed his collection of vintage cars, a riding lawnmower, and various tools and equipment. In the far corner, separated by a half wall, was a small stable area where they kept Phantom, the white horse Richard had purchased for Eleanor's birthday 3 years ago, a gift she had never asked for but had come to love deeply. Richard unlocked the heavy wooden doors and pushed them open, revealing the cavernous interior. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through dust particles, creating beams of gold in the dimness. The smell of hay, motor oil, and horse filled the air. "Dad, what are we doing here?" James asked, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. Richard walked over to a workbench and switched on a lamp, casting a warm glow over that section of the barn. "We're going to learn how to fight." James's eyes widened. "But Mom says fighting doesn't solve problems." "Your mother means well," Richard said, removing his suit jacket and rolling up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt. "But there are some things she doesn't understand. Sometimes, James, you have to show strength to gain respect. That's a lesson I learned young, and it's one you need to learn now." For the next hour, Richard attempted to teach his son the basics of boxing: how to stand, how to hold his fists, how to throw a punch. But James was a reluctant student. His movements were awkward, his punches lacking any real force. When Richard held up his hands as targets, James barely made contact. "You're not even trying," Richard said, frustration evident in his voice. "Put your weight behind it. Like this." He demonstrated a punch that sliced through the air with precision and power. James tried to mimic the movement, but his arm seemed to move in slow motion, his fist gently tapping against Richard's palm. "Again," Richard commanded. "Harder this time." James tried again, with similar results. "Are you doing this on purpose?" Richard demanded. "Are you deliberately trying to fail?" "No, Dad." James's voice cracked. "I'm trying. I really am." "Well, try harder." Richard grabbed James's shoulders, his fingers digging into the boy's flesh. "This isn't a joke, James. The world is a tough place. If you don't learn to be tough, you'll get eaten alive. Is that what you want?" James's eyes filled with tears. "No, sir." "Then stop crying and hit like you mean it." Richard released his son's shoulders and held up his hands again. "Now." James swung his fist, putting all his strength behind it. The punch connected with Richard's palm with a solid smack. "Better," Richard nodded. "Again." They continued for another half-hour, with James gradually improving under his father's relentless coaching. But it was clear the boy's heart wasn't in it. Each punch seemed to drain him further, his shoulders slumping more with each effort. Finally, Richard stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. The frustration that had been building within him all afternoon had reached its peak. He looked at his son red-faced, sweaty, and clearly miserable and felt a deep disappointment that bordered on disgust. "This is pointless," he said coldly. "You're not even trying to get it." "I am trying, Dad," James protested weakly. "I just don't understand why I need to know how to fight. Mr. Dawson says—" "I don't give a damn what Mr. Dawson says," Richard exploded. "This isn't about what some soft-headed teacher thinks. This is about you becoming a man who can stand on his own 2 feet. But clearly, that's asking too much." James flinched at his father's outburst, taking a step back. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'll try harder." "No," Richard shook his head. "We're done for today. I need some time to think about how to handle this situation. Can we go back to the house now?" James asked, relief evident in his voice. Richard looked at his son, and in that moment, all he could see were the ways in which James failed to measure up to his expectations. The disappointment was so acute, it felt like physical pain. Without fully thinking through his actions, Richard made a decision. "No," he said firmly. "You're going to stay here for a while, and think about what it means to be a Harper man. Maybe some time alone will help you find your backbone." James's eyes widened in alarm. "Stay here? By myself?" "That's right." Richard nodded. "Sometimes a boy needs solitude to find his inner strength." "But Dad, it's getting dark soon. And—" "There's a lantern on the workbench," Richard cut him off. "And Phantom's here. You won't be completely alone." James glanced nervously at the white horse in its stall. Phantom was watching them with curious eyes, his ears perked forward. "How long do I have to stay?" James asked, his voice small. "Until morning," Richard said decisively. "Consider it a camping trip. There's plenty of hay to make a comfortable spot to sleep." "But what about dinner?" "And Mom will worry." "I'll tell your mother you're fine," Richard said. "As for dinner, missing one meal won't kill you. It might even build some character." James's lower lip trembled, but he didn't argue further. Richard felt a twinge of guilt at the fear in his son's eyes, but he pushed it aside. This was for James's own good. Sometimes tough love was the only way. "I'll come get you in the morning," Richard said, already walking toward the barn doors. "Use this time to think about what kind of man you want to be, James. A Harper man, or—" He left the alternative unspoken, hanging in the air between them. Without waiting for a response, Richard stepped outside and pulled the heavy doors closed. There was a large wooden beam that served as a lock, sliding into metal brackets on either side of the doors. Richard hesitated for only a moment before sliding the beam into place with a definitive thud. From inside the barn, he heard James's voice, pitched higher with panic. "Dad? Dad, please don't lock it." Richard stood frozen, his hand still on the wooden beam. A small voice in the back of his mind screamed that this was wrong, that he was crossing a line. But a louder voice, one that sounded remarkably like his own, father's, told him this was necessary. This was how boys became men. "Dad!" James's voice cracked. "I'm scared of the dark." "Please." Richard took a step back from the doors. "You have the lantern," he called, his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. "And I told you, Phantom's in there. You're not alone." "Please." James was crying now, his words punctuated by hiccuping sobs. "I'll try harder with the boxing. I promise. Just don't leave me here." For a moment, Richard wavered. But then he thought of James cowering before the school bully, running to the principal instead of standing his ground. He thought of the disappointment he had felt watching his son throw those weak, ineffectual punches. He thought of his own father and the lessons he had learned in that man's harsh tutelage. "I'll see you in the morning, James," he said firmly. "Try to get some sleep." As Richard walked back toward the house, he could still hear his son's muffled cries. He quickened his pace, telling himself that this was a necessary lesson, that James would thank him for it someday. By the time he reached the back patio, he had almost convinced himself it was true. Eleanor was waiting for him in the kitchen, her arms crossed over her chest. "Where's James?" she demanded. Richard busied himself washing his hands at the sink, avoiding her gaze. "He's in the barn." "Doing what?" "Thinking," Richard said. "I've decided he needs some time to reflect on his behavior." Eleanor's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What does that mean, exactly?" Richard dried his hands on a kitchen towel, still not meeting her eyes. "It means he's spending the night in the barn." "He's what?" Eleanor's voice rose sharply. "Are you out of your mind, Richard? Go get him right now." "No." Richard finally looked at her, his jaw set stubbornly. "This is what he needs, Eleanor. A night on his own to build some independence, to find his courage. What he needs is his father's love and support, not to be abandoned in a barn like an animal." Eleanor's face was flushed with anger. "I'm going to get him." She moved toward the back door, but Richard caught her arm. "Don't undermine me on this, Eleanor. I'm trying to help him." "Help him?" Eleanor wrenched her arm free. "This isn't help, Richard. This is cruelty. This is you trying to break him and remake him in your image." "That's not what this is," Richard insisted, though a part of him wondered if she was right. "Did you at least give him dinner? A blanket? A flashlight?" Richard's silence was answer enough. Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. "You left our 12-year-old son alone in a dark barn, with no food, no comfort, nothing? Who are you, Richard? Because right now, I don't recognize you at all." "He has a lantern," Richard said weakly, "and Phantom's there." "Oh, well, a horse makes all the difference." Eleanor's voice dripped with sarcasm. "I'm getting him. Now." "Eleanor," Richard's voice hardened. "If you go out there and bring him back, you're teaching him that he can run from his problems, that he doesn't have to face challenges head-on." "And what are you teaching him by locking him in a barn overnight?" Eleanor challenged. "That his father is someone he can't trust? That love is conditional on being the kind of boy you want him to be?" Richard had no answer for that. The two of them stood in tense silence, the weight of their unspoken thoughts filling the space between them. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice tired. "I've supported you in a lot of things, Richard. I stood by while you worked 80-hour weeks building your company. I've smiled at your business associates and played the perfect wife at your charity galas. I've even kept quiet when you've been too harsh with James in the past. But this crosses a line I can't accept." "One night, Eleanor," Richard said, his tone softer now. "Just give it one night. If he's still upset in the morning, I promise I'll make it up to him. But let's at least see if this helps him find some inner strength." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with a sadness that cut Richard to the core. "I don't think you understand what strength really is," she said quietly. "And I'm afraid of what James will learn from you tonight." Without another word, she turned and left the kitchen, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor as she climbed the stairs to their bedroom. Richard stood alone in the kitchen, the house suddenly too quiet around him. He walked to the liquor cabinet and poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey, downing it in one burning gulp. As the alcohol warmed his chest, he tried to ignore the voice in his head telling him he had made a terrible mistake. Out in the barn, James Harper sat huddled on a pile of hay, his knees drawn up to his chest. The lantern cast eerie shadows on the barn walls, making ordinary objects look monstrous in the dim light. Every creak of the old structure, every rustle of hay, every whinny from Phantom sent a jolt of fear through the boy's body. He had cried for what felt like hours. After his father had left, his sobs echoing in the cavernous space. Now, his eyes were dry, but his chest felt hollow, as if something essential had been scooped out of him. "He's coming back in the morning," James whispered to himself, rocking slightly. "Just have to make it through the night." From his stall, Phantom watched the boy with intelligent eyes. The white horse had been a fixture in James's life for 3 years now, though James had always been a bit intimidated by the massive animal. His mother rode Phantom regularly, moving with grace and confidence, but James had never felt comfortable around horses. They were too big, unpredictable. But now, Phantom's presence was oddly comforting. At least he wasn't completely alone. "Hey, boy," James called softly. "You stuck here too, huh?" Phantom nickered in response, tossing his magnificent head. "Yeah, I know," James continued, pretending the horse understood him. "It's not fair. But at least you're used to sleeping in the barn. This is all new to me." James glanced at his watch, a birthday gift from his mother. It was just past 8 o'clock. The night stretched before him, long and daunting. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since lunch. He had been too upset after the incident with Brad Thompson to eat much then, and now he was paying for it with gnawing hunger. "I don't suppose you have any people food hidden in here?" James asked Phantom, who simply continued to watch him with those large liquid eyes. James sighed and looked around the barn. His father's vintage car collection gleamed dully in the lantern light. A 1965 Mustang, a 1957 Chevy Bel Air, and a 1970 Dodge Charger. In another life, James might have been impressed by the vehicles, might have wanted to learn about them from his father. But Richard had never shown any interest in sharing his passion for cars with his son, perhaps sensing that James wouldn't appreciate them the way he did. And he was right. James couldn't see what was so special about hunks of metal and chrome. Give him a pencil and paper, and he could create worlds far more interesting than anything these cars represented. Thinking of drawing made James miss his sketchbook, now ruined thanks to Brad Thompson. He had been working on a series of horse drawings, studying Phantom from his bedroom window as his mother rode the magnificent animal around their property. He had been particularly proud of a drawing that captured Phantom mid-gallop, his white mane flying in the wind, his powerful legs extended in perfect form. Now that drawing, like all the others, was destroyed. The thought brought fresh tears to James's eyes. "I wish I could draw you now," he told Phantom, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "You look different in this light. More, I don't know, magical or something?" Phantom tossed his head again, as if pleased by the compliment. James stood up, his legs stiff from sitting in one position for so long. He approached Phantom's stall cautiously. The horse watched him come closer, ears pricked forward with interest. "You won't bite me, will you?" James asked nervously. "Mom says you're gentle, but you're just so big." Phantom extended his neck, reaching his nose toward James. The boy hesitated, then slowly raised his hand, letting the horse sniff him. Phantom's breath was warm against his palm, his nostrils velvety soft. "There, see? Not so scary after all," James said, more to himself than to the horse. He tentatively stroked Phantom's nose, marveling at the softness of his coat. Phantom seemed to enjoy the attention, leaning into James's touch. For the first time since being locked in the barn, James felt a small smile tug at his lips. "You're not so bad," he told the horse. "Maybe Mom's right about you." As if understanding the compliment, Phantom nuzzled James's hand gently. James spent the next hour or so talking to Phantom, finding comfort in the one-sided conversation. He told the horse about school, about Brad Thompson and the ruined sketchbook, about his father's disappointment in him. Phantom listened with what seemed like genuine interest, occasionally nickering or tossing his head as if in response. "I wish I could be what Dad wants," James confided, leaning against the stall door. "But I just don't see the world the way he does. Fighting seems so pointless. Why hit someone when you could talk to them instead? Mom says violence just creates more violence, but Dad thinks that makes me weak." Phantom nudged James's shoulder gently. "You don't think I'm weak, do you?" James asked the horse. "Just because I don't want to hurt people?" Phantom's large, intelligent eyes seemed to hold the answer, though James couldn't quite decipher it. Eventually, exhaustion began to overtake the boy. He returned to his pile of hay, arranging it as best he could into a makeshift bed. He removed his jacket, balling it up to use as a pillow. "Good night, Phantom," he called softly. "Thanks for keeping me company." As James drifted into an uneasy sleep, the last thing he saw was the white horse standing sentinel in his stall, watching over him in the dim lantern light. Back at the house, Richard Harper sat alone in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand. It was his third oar, Maybe his fourth of the evening. The alcohol had dulled the edges of his guilt, but couldn't erase it completely. Eleanor had not come down for dinner. She had remained in their bedroom, the door firmly closed, her silence more damning than any words could have been. Richard had eaten alone in the dining room, the emptiness of the house pressing in on him. James's vacant chair across the table had seemed to accuse him with every bite he took. Now, sitting in the leather chair behind his desk, Richard stared out the window at the dark shape of the barn in the distance. A single point of light glowed faintly through one of the small windows of the lantern, still burning. "It's for his own good," Richard muttered to himself, taking another sip of whiskey. He needs to learn. But learn what exactly? The question nagged at him, refusing to be silenced by alcohol or rationalization. Richard's phone buzzed on the desk beside him. He glanced at it, seeing a text message from his friend and business partner, William Crawford. "Just checking to make sure we're still on for golf tomorrow morning. 7 a.m. tea time." Richard stared at the message, suddenly remembering the plans he had made earlier in the week. He had completely forgotten about golf in the chaos of the afternoon. He tacked a quick response. "Yes, still on. See you then." As he hit send, Richard glanced at the time on his phone, 10:38 p.m. James had been in the barn for nearly 5 hours now. Richard wondered if the boy was sleeping, or if he was still huddled fearfully in the darkness. A memory surfaced, unbidden. James at 4 years old, terrified of the dark, screaming for his parents when the nightlight in his room had burned out. Richard had held him then, rocking him gently, promising that no monsters lurked in the shadows. "There's nothing to be afraid of," he had whispered into his son's hair. "Daddy's here. I'll always protect you." Where was that father now? The one who had promised protection, not punishment? Richard drained his glass and set it down hard on the desk. He was doing this for James's protection, he reminded himself. The world was a harsh place, especially for sensitive boys who drew pictures and ran from fights. Better a hard lesson now than a lifetime of being victimized. Still, as Richard finally made his way upstairs to the bedroom he shared with Eleanor, where he knew he would find her pretending to be asleep, turned away from his side of the bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had broken something precious today, something that might not be easily mended. In the barn, James woke with a start, disoriented in the unfamiliar darkness. The lantern had gone out, leaving only the faint moonlight filtering through the small windows to illuminate the space. It took him a moment to remember where he was and why. When the memories flooded back, he felt a fresh wave of hurt and abandonment wash over him. His watch glowed faintly in the darkness. 2:17 a.m. Still hours to go before morning. James sat up, brushing hay from his hair and clothes. His mouth was dry, his stomach painfully empty. The barn seemed even larger and more forbidding in the darkness, the shadows deeper, the sounds more mysterious. From Phantom's stall came the soft sounds of the horse shifting in his sleep. The animal's presence was still comforting, a reminder that James wasn't entirely alone in this strange punishment. As James's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he noticed something odd about the lantern. It was lying on its side, not where he had left it when he fell asleep. Had he knocked it over without realizing it? He stood carefully and made his way to the workbench where the lantern lay. As he reached for it, intending to see if it could be relit, his fingers brushed against something that shouldn't have been there, a book of matches. James frowned. He didn't remember seeing matches earlier. His father had simply told him there was a lantern, not how to relight it if it went out. Had someone been in the barn while he slept? The thought sent a chill down James's spine. He quickly looked around, half expecting to see a stranger lurking in the shadows. But the barn was still, with only the occasional creak of the old structure breaking the silence. Then a more hopeful thought occurred to him. Had his mother come to check on him? The idea brought tears of relief to his eyes. Of course Mom wouldn't have left him alone all night. She must have snuck out after Dad was asleep, making sure he was okay. "Mom?" James called softly, hope rising in his chest. "Are you here?" No answer came, just the slight stirring of Phantom in his stall. James's shoulders slumped. It had been a foolish hope. His mother would have woken him if she had come, would have brought in food or a blanket at the very least. But then, who had left the matches? As James pondered this mystery, he became aware of a new smell in the barn, something acrid and chemical that hadn't been there when he fell asleep. It reminded him of the smell when his father used starter fluid on the grill during summer cookouts. James's heart began to race. Something wasn't right. He fumbled with the matches, striking one against the rough strip on the side of the book. It flared to life, illuminating a small circle around him. He quickly relit the lantern, adjusting the wick to create a steady flame. With the lantern held high, James turned slowly, examining the barn. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The vintage cars sat silently in their places. The tools hung neatly on the wall above the workbench. Phantom watched him curiously from his stall. But then James noticed something that made his blood run cold, a dark puddle spreading slowly across the concrete floor near his father's prized Mustang. The acrid smell was stronger there, and as James cautiously approached, he recognized the distinctive odor of gasoline. The fuel cap of the Mustang was open, a trail of gasoline leading from it to form the puddle. And beside the puddle, a second book of matches, this one open, several matches torn out and discarded nearby. James's heart hammered in his chest. Someone had been in the barn. Someone had deliberately opened the fuel tank and spilled gasoline on the floor. Someone had tried to light it. But why? And who? Before James could process these questions, a new sound reached his ears, the soft crackle of flames. He spun around, lantern held high, and saw a small fire burning near the back wall of the barn, where old hay and miscellaneous junk had been stored for years. The flames were still small, licking tentatively at the dry hay, but growing steadily stronger. "No," James whispered, panic rising in his throat. "No, no, no." He looked frantically around for something to extinguish the fire with. His father kept a fire extinguisher somewhere in the barn, but in the dim light and his panicked state, James couldn't remember where. The fire was spreading quickly now, the dry hay providing perfect fuel. Smoke began to fill the upper part of the barn, thick and choking. James ran to Phantom's stall, his mind racing. The horse was already agitated, sensing the danger, moving restlessly in the confined space. "We have to get out," James told the horse, his voice high with fear. "The barn's on fire." He fumbled with the latch on Phantom's stall, his fingers clumsy with panic. The horse whinnied loudly, rearing slightly in the small space. "Easy, boy," James tried to sound calm, though his voice shook. "I'm going to get us out of here." Finally, the latch gave way, and the stall door swung open. Phantom immediately pushed past James, trotting nervously around the barn, nostrils flaring at the smell of smoke and fire. James ran to the main doors of the barn, the ones his father had locked from the outside. He pushed against them with all his strength, but they didn't budge. The wooden beam on the outside held firm. "Help!" James screamed, pounding on the doors with his fists. "Someone help! Fire!" But the barn was too far from the house for anyone to hear his cries. And it was the middle of the night. His parents were surely asleep, unaware of the danger their son was in. The fire was growing rapidly now, spreading along the back wall of the barn and beginning to climb up to the hayloft above. The smoke was getting thicker, making it hard to breathe, hard to see. James coughed violently, his eyes watering. He had to find another way out. There was a side door, he remembered suddenly, that led out to a small paddock. It was used when exercising Phantom. Squinting through the smoke, James made his way toward where he thought the door should be. Phantom followed, staying close to the boy, as if understanding that James was trying to lead them to safety. The side door was smaller than the main doors, just a simple wooden door with a normal handle. James reached for it, hope searching, but it too was locked. "No!" James cried, pulling futilely at the handle. "Please, no!" The fire was consuming the barn now, the heat intense even from a distance. The smoke was becoming unbearable, making James's lungs burn with each breath. He stumbled back toward the center of the barn, disoriented and terrified. Phantom stayed near him, the horse's eyes wild with fear, but seemingly unwilling to leave the boy's side. "The windows!" James gasped, looking up at the small windows near the ceiling of the barn. They were too high to reach, and likely too small for him to fit through anyway. The realization hit him with devastating clarity. He was trapped. The barn was burning around him, and there was no way out. Tears streamed down James's face, cutting clean tracks through the soot that had already accumulated there. He was going to die here, alone in this barn, punished for a crime he hadn't committed. The crime of being himself. "Dad," he whispered, though he knew his father couldn't hear him. "I'm sorry I couldn't be what you wanted." The smoke was getting thicker by the second, making it increasingly difficult to breathe. James dropped to his knees, remembering something he had learned in school about staying low to the ground where the air was cleaner. But even there, the smoke was becoming unbearable. Phantom circled nervously nearby, his white coat ghostly in the flickering light of the fire. The horse was smart enough to be terrified, yet something kept him from panicking completely. Some bond with the boy that overrode his natural instinct to flee at all costs. James crawled toward the main doors again, desperation giving him strength. He pounded on them once more, screaming for help until his voice was raw. But the only answer was the roar of the flames, growing louder as they consumed more of the barn. The heat was becoming intense now, the fire having spread to one of the vintage cars. The gas tank of the Mustang exploded with a deafening boom, sending a fireball rolling across the ceiling of the barn. James threw himself flat on the ground, covering his head with his arms, as debris rained down around him. When he looked up again, the situation had worsened dramatically. The entire back half of the barn was engulfed in flames, and the fire was spreading quickly toward the front where he crouched. The smoke was so thick now that he could barely see Phantom just a few feet away. James began to cough uncontrollably, each breath bringing more smoke into his lungs. His eyes burned. His throat felt like it was closing up. The world began to spin around him, his vision tunneling. "Mom!" he gasped, thinking of his mother's face, wishing he could see her one more time. "Dad!" Despite everything, he still called for his father, the man who had put him in this situation, the man whose approval he had sought his entire young life. Even now, facing death, some part of James still hoped his father would come, would save him, would finally see him for who he was, and love him anyway. As consciousness began to slip away, James became aware of Phantom moving beside him. The horse was nudging him insistently with his nose, trying to get him to stand. "Can't," James mumbled, his thoughts becoming foggy. "Too tired, boy." But Phantom was persistent, pushing against James with greater urgency. When the boy still didn't respond, the horse did something unexpected. He carefully took the collar of James's shirt between his teeth and tugged. Under normal circumstances, James might have been frightened by this behavior. But now, hovering on the edge of consciousness, he found it oddly comforting. At least he wouldn't die completely alone. At least this magnificent creature seemed to care whether he lived or died. With one last surge of awareness, James reached up and touched Phantom's face. "Good horse," he whispered. "I'm sorry." Then darkness claimed him, and James Harper knew no more. Back at the main house, Richard Harper sat bolt upright in bed, torn from sleep by a sound he couldn't immediately identify. Beside him, Eleanor stirred but didn't wake. Richard glanced at the clock on his nightstand, 3:24 a.m. What had woken him? Then he heard it again, a distant explosion, followed by the unmistakable sound of a car alarm. His car alarm. Richard threw back the covers and rushed to the window, peering out into the night. What he saw turned his blood to ice. The barn was on fire. Flames licked up the sides of the old wooden structure, smoke billowing into the night sky. Even from this distance, Richard could feel the wrongness of it, the absolute horror of what he was seeing. "James," he whispered, his son's name like a prayer on his lips. Then, louder, "James!" Eleanor woke at his shout, sitting up in confusion. "Richard? What's?" "The barn's on fire." Richard was already moving, grabbing his robe, fumbling for his phone. "James is in there." Eleanor's face drained of color. Without a word, she leapt from the bed and ran from the room, not even pausing to put on slippers or a robe over her nightgown. Richard dialed 911 with shaking fingers as he raced down the stairs after his wife. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. My barn is on fire, Richard shouted into the phone. My son is inside. Please send help. Sir, I need your address. Richard rattled off the address as he burst through the back door onto the patio, following Eleanor, who was already sprinting across the lawn toward the bar. Burning building. Fire department is on their way, the dispatcher assured him. Estimated arrival time is 7 minutes. Sir, is there any way to get your son out of the barn? I don't know, Richard panted, running as fast as he could. It's locked. I locked him in. The admission was torn from him, heavy with guilt and terror. You locked him in? The dispatcher's professional tone slipped for just a moment, revealing shock. Yes. Richard couldn't continue, couldn't explain the inexplicable, couldn't justify what now seemed like madness. Please, just hurry. He ended the call, shoving the phone into the pocket of his robe as he ran. Ahead of him, Eleanor had reached the barn and was frantically trying to remove the wooden beam that secured the doors. Richard! She screamed when she saw him. Help me! Together, they struggled with the heavy beam. It had expanded slightly in its brackets due to the heat, making it difficult to slide out. Richard threw his weight against it, ignoring the pain as splinters dug into his palms. James. Eleanor was sobbing, calling their son's name over and over. James, can you hear me? There was no response from inside, just the roar of the flames and the occasional crash as burning timbers fell. Finally, the beam gave way, tumbling to the ground. Richard and Eleanor pulled the doors open, only to be driven back by a wall of heat and smoke. James, Richard called, trying to peer through the smoke. James, where are you? The interior of the barn was a vision of hell. Flames danced across the ceiling and down the walls. The air was thick with black smoke. Through the haze, Richard could make out the burning shells of his vintage cars, their paint bubbling and peeling in the intense heat. But of James and Phantom, there was no sign. I'm going in, Richard said, already moving forward. Eleanor grabbed his arm. You can't. You'll die. Our son is in there. Richard wrenched his arm free. I put him there. Before he could step into the inferno, a new sound cut through the roar of the fire, the pounding of hooves, coming from the far side of the barn. Richard and Eleanor turned in unison, just in time to see a sight they would never forget. Phantom, his magnificent white coat streaked with soot and ash, was charging toward the burning barn at full gallop. The horse's eyes were wild, his nostrils flared, his powerful legs eating up the distance with every stride. What is he? Eleanor began, but her words died in her throat as Phantom reached the barn. Instead of stopping, the horse gathered himself and leapt not through the open front doors, but at the side wall of the barn. The wood, weakened by the fire, gave way under the impact of the 1,000-pound animal. Phantom crashed through, disappearing into the smoke and flames. Oh my God, Richard breathed, unable to comprehend what he had just witnessed. For a moment that felt like eternity. There was nothing, just the crackling of the fire, the distant wail of approaching sirens, and the hammering of Richard's heart in his chest. Then, like a specter from another world, Phantom emerged from the smoke, bursting through the open front doors of the barn. And hanging limply from his mouth, held by the collar of his soot-stained t-shirt, was James. The horse galloped several yards away from the burning structure, before gently lowering the unconscious boy to the ground. Then Phantom stood over James, his legs planted firmly on either side of the child's body, as if still protecting him from harm. Richard and Eleanor ran to their son, falling to their knees beside him. James's face was black with soot, his clothes singed and filthy. He wasn't breathing. No, 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 Eleanor moaned, gathering James into her arms. Please, baby, breathe. Richard, operating on some long-buried memory of a first-aid course, tilted his son's head back, pinched his nose, and gave him 2 rescue breaths. Then he began chest compressions, counting under his breath, tears streaming down his face. "Don't you die," he told his son fiercely between compressions. "Don't you dare die, James. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please don't leave us." After what seemed like an eternity but was probably less than a minute, James convulsed suddenly, coughing violently. Black soot spewed from his mouth, as his body fought to expel the smoke from his lungs. "That's it," Richard encouraged, turning his son onto his side to help clear his airway. "Breathe, son. Just breathe." James's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "Dad?" he rasped, his voice barely audible. "Mom?" "We're here, baby," Eleanor sobbed, stroking his filthy hair. "We're right here." "Phantom," James whispered. "He saved me." As if hearing his name, the white horse lowered his magnificent head, gently nuzzling the boy's cheek. Despite everything, James managed a small smile, reaching up weakly to touch Phantom's nose. The wail of sirens grew louder, and suddenly the property was bathed in the flashing lights of fire trucks and ambulances. People were running toward them, firefighters in heavy gear, paramedics with medical bags. Richard looked up to see that they had an audience. News of the fire had spread quickly through the neighborhood, and several families stood at the edge of the property, watching the drama unfold. Among them, Richard recognized the Thompsons, including Brad, the boy who had bullied James at school. As the paramedics gently moved Eleanor aside to attend to James, Richard found himself face to face with his son's tormentor. The boy was staring wide-eyed at the scene before him, at James being lifted onto a stretcher, at Phantom standing sentinel nearby, at the barn still burning despite the firefighters' best efforts. "Did that horse just save him?" Brad asked, his voice small and odd. Richard looked at the boy, really seeing him for the first time. Not a bully, not a threat, just a child someone else's James. "Yes," Richard said simply. "He did what I should have done. He protected my son." Brad's father, a burly man in a bathrobe, put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Is the boy going to be okay?" he asked Richard. "I don't know," Richard admitted, his voice breaking. "I hope so." A paramedic approached, interrupting the conversation. "Sir, we're taking your son to Memorial Hospital. His condition is serious but stable. Would you like to ride in the ambulance with him?" "Yes." Richard nodded, then looked back at the Thompsons. "Excuse me." As he turned to follow the paramedic, Brad's voice stopped him. "Mr. Harper?" Richard looked back. Tell him I'm sorry about his sketchbook, and that I think his drawings are actually really good." Something shifted in Richard's chest at the boy's words, a recognition of the power of admitting when you're wrong, of the strength it takes to apologize. "I'll tell him," Richard promised. Then, to Brad's father, "Your son is a good kid." The man looked surprised, then nodded slowly. "So is yours." Richard followed the paramedics to the ambulance, where Eleanor was already sitting beside James, holding his hand. The boy was conscious but groggy, an oxygen mask covering his face. As Richard climbed into the vehicle, he caught a glimpse of Phantom being led away by one of the neighbor's misses, Chen, who kept horses of her own. The white stallion went willingly, though he kept looking back toward the ambulance, as if reluctant to leave James's side. The doors of the ambulance closed, and they were moving, sirens wailing into the night. Richard took his son's free hand, holding it gently in both of his own. "James," he said softly, "I'm so sorry. I was wrong. So terribly wrong." James's eyes, red-rimmed and watery, fixed on his father's face. He pulled the oxygen mask aside with his free hand. "It's okay, Dad," he whispered, his voice raw from smoke. "I know you didn't mean for this to happen. Not just a fire." Richard shook his head, tears spilling down his cheeks. "Everything. I've been trying to make you into someone you're not, someone you shouldn't have to be." Eleanor reached across their son to take Richard's hand, forming a circle of connection between the three of them. "I thought I knew what strength was," Richard continued, his voice choked with emotion. "I thought it was about fighting, about never backing down. But tonight, I saw real strength. I saw it in Phantom, who went back into a burning building to save you. I saw it in your mother, who never stopped believing in you, even when I didn't. And I see it in you, James, not because you can throw a punch, but because of who you are. Your kindness, your creativity, your heart, that's real strength. James's eyes filled with tears that spilled over, leaving clean tracks on his sooty face. Do you really mean that, Dad? With all my heart, Richard nodded. I promise you, from this day forward, I will never again ask you to be anyone but exactly who you are. And I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of being your father. James's hand tightened around his father's, a silent acceptance of the promise. Eleanor squeezed both their hands, her eyes full of love and forgiveness. As the ambulance sped through the night toward the hospital, Richard Harper held tight to his family and to the lesson he had learned at such terrible cost, that true strength isn't found in domination or control, but in the courage to love unconditionally, to admit when you're wrong, and to protect what truly matters. Days later, when James was released from the hospital treated for smoke inhalation but otherwise miraculously unharmed, the Harper family returned to their property to find something unexpected waiting for them. The barn was ash, gone, reduced to a charred skeleton by the fire. Richard's vintage cars were destroyed, along with everything else that had been stored inside. But in the paddock adjacent to where the barn had stood, a familiar white figure grazed graze peacefully. Phantom! James cried, his face lighting up at the sight of the horse. Mrs. Chen approached from where she had been waiting by the paddock fence. He's been pining for you, she told James. Wouldn't eat properly, kept looking down the Sia road. I think he was waiting for you to come home. James walked slowly to the fence, still weak from his ordeal. Phantom raised his head at the boy's approach, then trotted over, nickering softly in greeting. Hey, boy, James said, reaching out to stroke the horse's nose. I missed you too. Richard and Eleanor watched their son with the animal that had saved his life, both of them blinking back tears. I've been thinking, Richard said quietly to his wife, about rebuilding the barn. Eleanor tensed slightly beside him. Richard, not as a barn, he clarified quickly, as an art studio. For James, a place where he can draw and paint and create. A place that celebrates who he is, not who I thought he should be. Eleanor's face softened, and she leaned against her husband's shoulder. He'd love that. And maybe, Richard continued, watching as his son pressed his forehead against Phantom's, both boy and horse seeming to draw comfort from the contact, he might want to learn to ride. If he's interested. No pressure. Just an option. I think he might be. Eleanor smiled. After all, he and Phantom have a special bond now. As if hearing his name, Phantom raised his head and looked directly at Richard. In the horse's intelligent eyes, Richard saw something that looked remarkably like judgment, as if the animal were taking his measure, deciding whether he was worthy of forgiveness. Richard approached the fence slowly, standing beside his son. Phantom watched him, warily. Thank you, Richard said softly to the horse, for being braver than I was, for saving my son when I couldn't. Phantom studied him for a long moment, then extended his nose toward Richard, allowing the man to touch him briefly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. Dad? James looked up at his father, his eyes clear and direct. I was thinking, maybe we could take those boxing gloves, the ones from the barn that got burned up. Richard tensed, wondering where this was going. And maybe we could donate some new ones to the community center? For kids who actually want to learn boxing? And maybe I could volunteer there, teaching art or something? To the same kids? Richard stared at his son in wonder. After everything that had happened, after all the pain Richard had caused him, James's instinct was not to reject his father's interests entirely, but to find a way to honor them while staying true to himself. That, Richard realized, was true strength. I think that's a wonderful idea, he told his son, his voice thick with emotion. We'll do it together. As they stood there in the autumn sunshine of father and son and mother, with the white horse that had changed everything, a new family took shape. Not perfect, not without scars, but stronger for having been broken and remade. And, in the days and years that followed, when people in town spoke of the Harpers, they no longer whispered about Richard's ruthlessness or James's sensitivity. Instead, they told the story of a night when a white horse broke through a burning barn to save a boy and in doing so, saved a family too. Some said it was just animal instinct, that Phantom had acted out of self-preservation, and James's rescue was a fortunate side effect. Others, especially those who had been there that night, believed something more profound had occurred, that they had witnessed an act of pure love, of sacrifice, of a bond that transcended species. As for James Harper, he simply knew that in his darkest moment, when he had felt most alone and abandoned, something extraordinary had happened. Something that taught him and his father what real strength looked like. And every time he rode Phantom across the fields of their property, wind in his hair and joy in his heart, with his father watching proudly from the porch of the art studio that had risen from the ashes of the barn, he remembered Dale. That lesson anew. True strength wasn't found in dominance or power. It was found in connection, in compassion, in the courage to be yourself and to love others for exactly who they are. That was the lesson of the white horse who broke through.